Okay, folks, why don't we go ahead and get started? I'd like to welcome everybody to today's seminar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Levi Browdy. I'm the Executive Director with the Falun Gong Information Center. We're very pleased to have the experts with us today and have this opportunity to kind of discuss the increasingly relevant topic of the Chinese Communist Party's transnational repression on American universities and how it's affecting Falun Gong practitioners and other dissident voices on campus. So a little background first. As many of you know, Falun Gong is a Buddhist-based spiritual practice that emerged from the heartland of China in the 1990s. It involves meditation, slow motion exercises, and living by three core principles: truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. Falun Gong was introduced to the public in China in 92, but by 1999, just 7 years later, the Chinese regime found that there were 70 to 100 million people practicing, which was tens of millions more than the Chinese Communist Party members themselves at the time. So because of its popularity and also because it really represented a reemergence of traditional cultural values, the head of the CCP at that time banned Falun Gong and launched a nationwide, very violent campaign to wipe out the practice. Right at the beginning, those very few first days, and continuing throughout the last 2.5 decades, Falun Gong practitioners in the United States have been targeted by the CCP as well. And we've seen the full gamut. We've seen illicit surveillance, physical attacks, death threats, and other acts of thuggery, business relationships, sabotage, nefarious pressure on our government leaders, etc. And this campaign, both inside China and outside China, has continued today for nearly a quarter of a century. And yet, both within China and globally, Falun Gong has survived and indeed thrived, with tens of millions of people in China still practicing. Today, Falun Gong is practiced in over 100 countries, and of course, that includes students and professors on university campuses the world over. So it's in this context that today's discussion of the situation on American universities fits in. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Ian Oxnevad, who will be moderating today's event. Ian is a senior fellow for Foreign Affairs and Security Studies at the National Institute of Scholars and a leading researcher on the issue of the Chinese regime's infiltration into America's education system. He's also the author of After Confucius, China's Enduring Influence in Higher Education, and he has almost without peer mastered the topic of the Confucius Institutes and sort of relevant issues there. He was a joy to listen to. I've seen him on many panels. Ian, honored to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Levi, for the introduction. So as Levi mentioned, I am the Senior Fellow of Foreign Affairs and Security Studies at the National Association of Scholars, or NAS. And the influence of Communist China and the Chinese Communist Party is something that's basically become one of the hallmarks of our expertise. And over the last few years, it's something that we've developed an expertise in the sense of how pervasive it is something that we didn't expect to find as pervasive as it is, both at the K through 12 level, but also at the universities and even beyond. And when I was invited to guest moderate this, I was eager to offer my assistance because this is an issue that's everyone's familiar with authoritarianism and the risk that authoritarianism poses in different countries, whether it be to civil rights, human rights, and over the past several years, particularly as China's forcibly reabsorbed Hong Kong, Russia's invaded Ukraine, you've seen crackdowns in Iran and elsewhere. The issue of transnational repression is something that doesn't get discussed very much. And transnational repression is a little different in that this is repression by authoritarian countries on dissidents across international borders. So this is not only an issue of sovereignty, but it's also an issue of human rights and something that doesn't get discussed very much. So I was eager to accept the offer to guest moderate for this institution. So Freedom House last year came out with a report called Still Not Safe, Transnational Repression in 2022. And it documented since 2014 almost 1,000 incidents of physical repression and coercion committed by 38 different governments around the world across 91 different countries. And last year alone, 79 of these incidents were documented and committed by a total of 20 different governments. And some of these are familiar, Russia and China being foremost among them, but also other governments that don't get as much scrutiny for this, such as Turkey and Tajikistan. And this has taken on a greater importance as these authoritarian regimes have not only started collaborating with each other increasingly at the geopolitical level, but also in light of recent events, such as the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and China's growing influence around the world. So with that, I'd like to introduce a fabulous panel of experts who are going to talk about this issue. And this is kind of a unique opportunity in that the experts that you're going to see here talk about this from three very different vantage points on this issue. And this is kind of neat how this occurs, because Cynthia is a lead researcher at the Falun Gong Information Center and recently authored her own report, Surveillance, Slander, and Censorship, How the Chinese Communist Party's Persecution Impacts Falun Gong Believers on U.S. University Campuses. And she's also one of the experts on how this group, this movement, Falun Gong, has been a target of choice by the Chinese Communist Party. So she offers kind of a movement-specific view of this. And at the same time, you have Grady Vaughan, who's a research associate at Freedom House. And he offers kind of an international perspective on this issue and how it's not just China, although China is arguably at the forefront in terms of its size. And he was one of the lead authors of Still Not Safe, that report that I mentioned that documents the increasing frequency at which authoritarian regimes are reaching across international borders, including into the United States, and working with each other to do so. Emily is a graduate student of the University of Pennsylvania School of Dental Medicine and was the president of University of Pennsylvania's Falun Gong Club up until a couple years ago in 2021. And she offers kind of a firsthand account of the reprisals that dissidents of the Chinese Communist Party face and how they face these reprisals across international boundaries, including in the United States, where constitutional rights have not been rescinded, but nonetheless, groups like the Chinese Communist Party have decided to spy on their dissidents within American borders. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Grady.
Thank you, Ian, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Falun Gong Information Center for having me today to share information about transnational oppression perpetrated by the People's Republic of China and other authoritarian governments. I'll first briefly discuss some key findings from our latest database update in April 2023, including which countries are among the worst perpetrators of transnational oppression. I will then focus on the comprehensive campaign of transnational oppression carried out by the PRC and the increasingly innovative tactics employed by the Chinese government to intimidate and harass exiles. Transnational oppression occurs when governments reach across borders to silence dissent among exile and diaspora communities. At Freedom House, we have created a global data set of direct physical incidents of transnational oppression since 2014, as Ian pointed out. By direct physical incidents, we refer to the use of tactics such as assassinations, assaults, arrests, illegal deportations, and abductions, among other tactics. Our April update to the data set includes 854 cases, so we're nearing 1,000, as Ian said. This number is a conservative estimate, as we only include publicly reported cases that we can verify. Additionally, many of the incidents on university campuses may not appear in the data set because the tactics are not always physical. We have found 38 countries to have engaged in transnational oppression. The top 5 worst perpetrators of transnational oppression are China, Turkey, Tajikistan, Russia, and Egypt. China alone accounts for 30% of all reported incidents of transnational oppression. It's important to note that cooperation between authoritarian governments is a key factor in driving transnational oppression. In 70% of the cases we recorded in 2022, both the origin and the host country are rated not free by Freedom House. While authoritarian governments around the world regularly seek to intimidate exiles, the PRC conducts the most sophisticated and comprehensive campaign of transnational oppression. In our data set, China accounts for double the number of cases as the next leading perpetrator of transnational oppression, Turkey. The PRC has targeted exiles in 36 countries, ranging from neighboring authoritarian states to democracies further afield. China's transnational pursuit of exiles represents only one part of its multi-pronged mission to spread its influence abroad through funding media and establishing joint security initiatives. This far-reaching campaign of transnational oppression stands out for several reasons. First, Beijing sets its sights not only on human rights defenders, journalists, political dissidents, and former insiders, but also on entire communities of religious and ethnic minorities. Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Falun Gong practitioners are among the main victims of this indiscriminate targeting. Increasingly, outspoken members of the Hong Kong diaspora have also found themselves caught in the dragnet, as pro-Beijing authorities in Hong Kong have applied the national security law extraterritorially to call for the arrest of wanted activists. Mainland Chinese students who dare to speak out have also become a prime group targeted by the PRC. Each incident targeting a member of one of these groups often yields a ripple effect, scaring the colleagues and family members of affected individuals, infringing upon their fundamental rights, and sowing distrust among wider diaspora communities. Second, the PRC has capitalized on its global influence to manipulate the security and migration institutions of host governments around the world. Beijing uses extradition treaties and legal agreements with other countries to facilitate the return of wanted individuals. Owing to its considerable geopolitical influence and leverage over other countries, the PRC has been able to get other countries to detain individuals and crack down on diaspora activism. A prime example of this increasing cooperation can be seen in China's relations with Turkey. Long considered a safe haven for Uyghurs fleeing China, Turkey has in recent years become less welcoming to Uyghurs due to Ankara's growing economic ties with Beijing. Interpol abuse is another facet of this international security cooperation employed by the PRC to secure the detention and deportation of exiles. China has used the International Police Organization to target ethnic and religious minorities, as well as former insiders accused of corruption under its Operation Fox Hunt. In March 2021, China successfully requested Interpol to issue a red notice against Uyghur activist Idris Hassan. Upon his arrival at the Casablanca airport in Morocco, Hassan was detained on the basis of this red notice. Although Interpol eventually retroactively invalidated this red notice, Hassan has been in detention ever since, facing the imminent threat of deportation. Even when a red notice does not result in the detention of a wanted individual, this designation may make it difficult for the individual to travel or conduct important financial transactions. Finally, the PRC's campaign of transnational repression relies on a variety of diverse and innovative tactics. The physical incidents of transnational repression described above that are perpetrated by the PRC are only the tip of the iceberg. Beyond these cases, which garner most of the media attention, the PRC's toolkit includes more everyday forms of transnational repression, such as digital surveillance, online threats, and mobility controls. A quite popular tactic for the PRC and other authoritarian regimes around the globe is coercion by proxy, or the punishment of relatives and friends of the exile back home. Security officials stay in close contact with the relatives of diaspora members and monitor phone calls between those abroad and their loved ones. Security agents have also been known to use these phone calls as a bargaining chip, threatening to cut off lines of contact if a diaspora member refuses to spy and report on other members of the diaspora. Over the last year, Beijing has begun to wield new and increasingly brazen tools to complicate the lives of individuals in exile. These innovations leave targets and law enforcement in the host countries on the back foot, as victims must combat new efforts to tarnish their reputations in often elaborate manners. Reports have recently emerged of individuals operating on behalf of the PRC using false threats or emergency calls to trigger local police action against targeted individuals. This tactic, known as swatting, brings unwanted police attention upon the targeted individual. For example, Germany-based Radio Free Asia journalist Su Yutong found out that beginning in October 2022, unnamed individuals called in bomb threats under her name and the names of 2 other exiles to luxury hotels in at least 6 countries. Su, who has also been the victim of other forms of transnational oppression listed above, told Voice of America that she had to move to an undisclosed location for safety reasons as a result of this targeting. Student activists from the PRC comprise a group that is particularly exposed to these more widespread everyday tactics of transnational oppression. Something so little as posting a message in commemoration of the Tiananmen Square protests or in solidarity with pro-democracy Hong Kong protesters may elicit a visit from security officials to a student's family members back home in China. On their university and college campuses in the United States, students who dare to share these opinions in class or organize human rights-themed events risk sparking backlash from pro-government Chinese students, as I'm sure other speakers will discuss in greater detail. Any expression of public opposition to the Chinese government's policies is often met with fierce opposition and denunciations on social media platforms. Over the last year and a half, student art displays and posters critical of Beijing at George Washington University have been reported by the university's Chinese Student and Scholar Association to campus administrators for allegedly insulting China. Likewise, last year, a student was assaulted during a demonstration at Columbia University. Absent a broader acknowledgement by universities of the negative effects of this sort of harassment on the academic freedom that this sort of harassment has on the academic freedom of international students, and the adoption of policies to address this issue, this problem will only persist. Acts of transnational oppression do not only undermine the human rights and security of targeted individuals, they also threaten the rule of law and democratic governance and violate the sovereignty of host countries. The ever-evolving nature of China's and other countries' transnational oppression campaigns requires a firm and coordinated response by host countries and multilateral institutions to signal their commitment to human rights and democratic values. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Grady. All right. So let's turn it over to Emily. Emily experienced transnational repression firsthand, and she's going to recount her experience.
Hi, Ian. Yes, thank you so much. So like Ian mentioned, I was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. And so the Falun Dafa Club and its events had been challenged multiple times throughout my time at Penn. But I'll just share two incidents of interference or pushback that the club faced that really stand out to me. So the first one was in November of 2020 during our promotion of a virtual screening of Falun Gong related human rights film titled Finding Courage. So shortly after we submitted the event details to GAPSA, the Graduate and Professional Student Assembly, their weekly newsletter, we were informed that some Chinese international students and alumni too, they had complained to GAPSA and Patch, the Pan-Asian American Community House, about the event. And what I found really interesting about this complaint was that these students were upset that the Falun Dafa Club was allowed to advertise their events in the UPenn GAPSA newsletter. So it wasn't, at the content of the film screening, it was that we had the right to, advertise our student events in the newsletter. And this was the first time that I realized, that not only would the nature of our events that we held as a club be challenged, but sort of our privileges as students on campus would also be challenged simply because we were Falun Gong practitioners. And after some discussion, the air was sort of cleared, that if Falun Dafa Club was a registered club on campus, which it was, then it indeed did have the right to advertise their events in this newsletter. And at this point, we were also connected with representatives from the CSSA, the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, to help clear any potential misunderstandings that could be, perceived from our hosting this human rights film screening event. And it was also suggested that we perhaps work together on this event, to which they declined due to the political nature of the event. And then a few months later, the UPenn Falun Dafa Club also held a virtual film screening of In the Name of Confucius in collaboration with over 10 other Falun Dafa clubs across North America, as well as Students for a Free Tibet and Athena Institute. So In the Name of Confucius is a documentary film that exposes the controversy over Confucius Institutes. University of Pennsylvania was offered a Confucius Institute contract and rejected that in 2009, which was a unanimous decision of the East Asian Studies faculty at the time. But just a few miles away from UPenn, however, Temple University did have an active Confucius Institute. And that same month, March of 2021, Tufts University closed its Confucius Institute, and the United States Senate unanimously passed a bill to tighten control over Confucius Institutes across the country. So our organization was, quite excited to host this very relevant film screening and discussion and present it to the UPenn student body. Our club also extended invitations to the university president, the provost, the CSSA, and the director of Temple University's Confucius Institute to join the film screening and discussion, on this issue of academic freedom and then Confucius Institutes. And at the time, I had also just joined the GAPSA executive board as executive vice president of programming. And in addition to newsletter advertisements, another service that GAPSA offers registered clubs on campus to advertise student events is social media posting, on the official GAPSA social media channels. And given that the subject matter of the film was particularly relevant at that time, and then also to the UPenn community, and also had to do with academic freedom in general, I suggested that our club submit this specific event for GAPSA social media promotion to reach a broader audience. And the event was published in the weekly newsletter and then on their social media channels. And the backlash from this was almost immediate, with comments and emails flooding in for almost 2 months straight, even after the event itself had happened. And again, what I found really interesting and surprising, to say the very least, were that most, if not all, complaints centered around a few arguments. So the first argument was that it was inappropriate for GAPSA to advertise an event hosted by the Falun Dafa Club, because choosing to advertise the Falun Dafa Club's event was in fact political propaganda offensive to Chinese students. 2, Falun Dafa Club, Students for a Free Tibet, and Athenai Institute are specifically anti-China groups with the sole purpose of criticizing China and provoking negative sentiment towards China and Chinese people. 3, that promoting the film screening was promoting hatred directed towards Asian people and specifically Chinese people. And then 4, that the content of the film screening and discussion were racist. And this was, quite a stressful and traumatic time for me and for our club members, because pretty much all of the public comments on the social media posts had nothing to do with the film screening itself, and were instead just personal attacks about the Falun Dafa Club and Falun Gong practitioners. We were called disgusting Chinese terrorists, and many comments expressed that GAPSA and Penn should be ashamed that they had stooped so low as to allow a Falun Dafa Club to exist on campus. And again, this film screening was not hosted by GAPSA. The Falun Dafa Club had simply utilized a service that's provided by the Graduate Student Assembly, offered to all registered clubs on campus. But even after the event had occurred, these complaints continued. Chinese students were still emailing and essentially pressuring GAPSA to be held accountable for the apparent anti-Chinese propaganda it had promoted, for its promotion of anti-Chinese hate, and then also to ensure that something like this would not happen again. There was even an open letter / petition that was started in protest to this film screening event. And the requests in this letter were quite shocking to me. Over 70 Chinese international students signed this letter, which claimed that the nature of the documentary and the film screening were highly controversial and political, and then offended many Chinese students on campus because it was, quote, the only political propaganda GAPSA advertised in this whole year. And so the letter stated that because GAPSA's decision to promote this event hosted by Falun Dafa Club, it had isolated and upset the Chinese population at Penn, that GAPSA should set future rules so that something like this would not happen again. It requested that any and all future promotions of events must be presented to the General Assembly and then unanimously voted upon. And then that if there were any students with concerns or oppositions to the posts after they were published, that GAPSA should withdraw these posts and delete them, take them down. And these requests were quite shocking to me because the CSSA is represented on GAPSA's board. There is a council member specifically representing the CSSA. So implementing this suggested policy would in fact marginalize Falun Gong practitioners on campus and essentially silence any promotion of Falun Gong Club events in order not to upset the Chinese international population at Penn. And what was further shocking to me was that at a GAPSA General Assembly meeting and then also a GAPSA Council meeting after the film screening, a Chinese international student was allowed to present basically his side, his concerns about the film screening and the promotion of the event, during which he showed slides that were highly misrepresentative of the film screening and the discussion's apparent racism towards Chinese people. And he also presented a slide that echoed Chinese Communist Party rhetoric that is specifically used to justify the imprisonment, torture, and persecution of Falun Gong practitioners in China. So he used these slides as a justification as to why it was wrong for GAPSA to have promoted a Falun Dafa Club event. And then this same Chinese international student, among others, also accused me of conflict of interest and using my position on the GAPSA executive board to specifically promote political propaganda for my own personal reasons, because I was on both the GAPSA executive board and then also part of the Falun Dafa Club. And at no point during any of this, emails, meetings, presentations included, were Falun Gong Club representatives invited or offered to join the discussion or given an opportunity to publicly respond to any of these claims. And, this was a very difficult time for me and other club members because, we're students first and foremost. We're balancing our schoolwork with the weight of all these personal attacks and pushback, and essentially also feeling unable to join the conversation and speak our part. And honestly, despite all this that happened, I still feel like I'm one of the lucky ones because, I felt that I could speak up safely if I was given the opportunity to. But a lot of Falun Gong practitioners or, dissident student voices on university campuses are not so lucky. During our hosting of the film screening of In the Name of Confucius, we had some host organization members specifically request not to be shown in any pictures related to the event or have their names published, because one of their parents was still currently jailed in China for practicing Falun Gong. And then another student whose life dream was to visit Tibet. And they worried that being shown in relation to this event that they helped host on an American university campus would put them or their family members physically in mainland China in jeopardy. And, I don't have any relatives who practice Falun Dafa that are physically in mainland China. And in general, I don't feel like I have to worry about the safety of myself or my family if I speak out against the persecution or publicly choose to take part in a club event, in the United States. But even so, around this time, with all these personal attacks and pushback, my parents were quite worried for my safety. And they sort of, warned me to be careful because I was outspoken and active in the Falun Dafa Club, and I often publicly associated myself with Falun Gong activism. So just to finish my portion here, I'll just highlight a few closing thoughts about my experience. I think through this whole process, one thing that I do appreciate is that the Office of Student Affairs sort of did step in to help steer the conversation in the right direction. And what I mean by that was that, the Falun Dafa Club's right to hold space on campus and right to open expression was being challenged. It had been challenged in the past and it was being challenged again. And appropriate administration did step in to make it clear, that complaints about the Falun Dafa Club's presence on campus and right to promote its events through GAPSA were not the same as concerns about the event itself. They were two completely separate issues, must be addressed separately and by the appropriate people. And it was also made clear, that the event did not violate university policies or the code of conduct. And so therefore, the club had not done anything wrong just because some Chinese international students were offended by the promotion of this event. But I think overall, more needs to be done to proactively support, the free expression of Falun Dafa practitioners on campus or dissident voices on campus and make them feel safe and welcome at their universities. I think there was such a knee-jerk negative reaction by most students as soon as the Chinese international students accused us of racism and offensive political propaganda that very few, if any, actually took the time to watch the film, analyze the situation and understand the event context. And by the time some students had come to understand the entire situation and that it really wasn't as simple as what the Chinese international students had said, the damage was already sort of done. And, so many Falun Gong practitioners on campus were already hurt by everything said and done and sort of felt not safe expressing themselves. And I just think overall, we felt very unsupported as a minority group on campus through this process. And I think partially this could just be because most universities and university administrations are just not prepared for something like this, that when it does happen, they're not really sure how to react. And then they err on the side of, what they think is caution to avoid potentially digging a deeper hole and then end up not saying anything. But in reality, I think this just further discourages marginalized groups from feeling like they have a place on campus and then they can openly express themselves without fear of retaliation. In this specific experience of mine, no administrators reached out first to our club directly to offer any support or opportunities to join the conversation. I even reached out to a contact at the university chaplain's office to sort of make them aware of this situation and ask for further assistance. And I didn't receive a response until about a month after all of these conversations had ended. Like this whole thing was a month-long process. It was a month before I received a response that I had asked for. And then it was only then that I even found out that, representatives from the chaplain's office had been aware of the situation and they had been discussing the situation with other parties involved or other administration. But again, Falun Dafa Club members were not brought into these conversations and were not directly offered any resources or support. So the Falun Dafa Club did publish its own letter to attempt to join the dialogue and express concern over the way that this event was misrepresented, to which it did not receive any responses from students or administrators. And again, I think the unsatisfactory way that this was handled might just be because universities are unprepared to deal with these situations. They really don't know what to say and worry that, anything that they do say might come back to bite them, so they just don't say anything. But to me, that's not really doing enough to protect free expression on campus. Universities should be proactive about making sure that Falun Gong practitioners or anyone really, any dissident voices, they're not feeling isolated, victimized, or that they need to self-censor on campus just to feel safe and welcome. And I know that what happened to us at Penn was, just one of many similar situations, and possibly on the less severe side, that is faced by Falun Gong practitioners or dissident voices on university campuses. So overall, I just think that there's still a lot much more that can be done by universities to improve in this aspect. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia or Emily. This is kind of opening up to everybody. I'd like to bring Cynthia in here, but this has kind of given us a good sense of the problem. And I'd like to ask, have you seen anything that universities have done right? And the reason I ask this is because there's a tension between universities sort of being these places of open idea, or at least in theory, these arenas for the exchange of open ideas. And at the same time, universities, because of their openness, are institutionally left vulnerable to misuse by authoritarian governments and their influence. So I'm kind of wondering, how has the university managed to do anything right in this regard, or are they just kind of unresponsive, or do they seem to be co-opted by the Chinese government in this case? Has the Office of International Student Affairs done anything? I'd like to open that up to the three of you. Include Cynthia in.
Just briefly on that point, and this might be a low bar, but there are at least 45 universities around the United States that have allowed the Falun Gong Club to be established, or for meditation events, different campus events, and documentary screenings, right, to be held. And like I said before, that's a very low bar. That's a right that every single student in any college in America should have. There was another case in New York where the Falun Gong Club had met with a lot of this reprisal, and they were worried about physical attacks. And so they actually contacted the campus police, and there was security put into place before the event began. So these are two things that I wanted to bring up real quick.
I have one that is sort of discussed in the film, In the Name of Confucius. So it's about Confucius Institutes. So the sort of controversy over Confucius Institutes sort of started when this one student, from mainland China, she had signed a contract with Confucius Institutes, and then she was working at her university in Canada. I think it was McMaster University. So I believe they are the only university to close down a Confucius Institute because of discriminatory hiring practices. So because in the contract that she signed, it specifically said, you cannot be a Falun Gong practitioner and work at Confucius Institute. So basically exporting that discrimination outside of China into Canada, not allowing Falun Gong practitioners to be hired. And from what I have read, that is the only university to ever cite that as the prime example of the prime reason why they closed down the Confucius Institutes. Tufts University, when they closed theirs, it was sort of this, our 2-year contract is up, we have decided to go different directions. Most universities are not stating this as the reason why they're closing the Confucius Institute. So that's, in my opinion, like one of the best examples of something a university can do. Directly cite the problem. Don't beat around the bush and not point out this problem. But from what I understand, McMaster University is the only one to actually specifically say that. Most universities are just like, we've decided to go different directions. We're not going to have the Confucius Institute anymore. They're not citing the reason why, these discriminatory hiring practices and the transnational repression of dissident voices outside of China.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I would like to echo something that Emily said earlier about the importance of solidarity. I think in general, as we've all acknowledged, there's a sort of a lack of understanding and awareness among universities when it comes to the scope of transnational oppression. So when a high profile incident occurs or a report emerges of this harassment, administrators often fail to kind of adequately speak out in support of affected parties. However, there was one instance that I would like to highlight as a more positive response to this issue and something that we would like to see more of. Following the publication of a ProPublica article in December 2021 on the threats faced by students from the PRC, Purdue University's president's office released a statement to condemn this targeting of one of his universities, of one Purdue student's targeting that was mentioned in this report or in this piece. The president made it clear that, quote, any such intimidation is unacceptable and unwelcome on our campus, end quote. While it's always preferable, as Emily pointed out, for universities to have more proactive responses and to establish some sort of response mechanism before an incident occurs, I do think that these types of firm statements in support of international students' rights and safety may make these students feel less alone. I do think the solidarity in general is very important.
So here's a question. Now, both of you have kind of, Cynthia and Emily, you've talked about the CSSA and the role that it's played in sort of importing transnational oppression from the People's Republic of China into American college campuses where your groups operate. And the State Department in 2020 issued a report specifically about the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, on campus, and how the CSSA was created specifically to extend this influence around the world. Has there been any push on your part or among allied organizations or by policymakers to have the CSSA designated under the Foreign Agent Registration Act? And as a follow-up to that, has there been any effort or programming to basically counter this idea that the PRC has a monopoly on Chinese identity on campus?
For the first question, the very first thing I thought of was recently there's been some statewide investigations. I know of at least one state that is going after like CCP influence within their borders, and they are currently under the process of trying to get the CSSAs and other CCP proxies within their borders relabeled and properly defined as foreign agents. I think your second question, sorry, can you repeat the second one again about Chinese identity?
Yeah, so there's this, one of the ways that they seem to be trying to silence Falun Dafa and any dissident organization like Atheni or whatever on campus seems to be this accusation of racism. And is there any effort to talk about how the PRC has no monopoly on Chinese identity? For example, is there programming talking about how Confucianism is actually abused as a concept by the CCP and how the CCP actually derives heavily from ancient Chinese legal theory, legalism, the legalist school? Has there been any efforts to discuss that, sort of raise that awareness? And this opens up to anybody. Emily can chime in too.
The first thing I thought of actually was that it's kind of, let's just say, like a jump in logic to say that Falun Gong is anti-China and racist, because it's a spiritual meditation based in Buddhist belief. It's practiced, like Levi said earlier, in over 100 countries. So it just doesn't really fit the square hole that the CCP is really trying to fit it in that sense, just because it's like translated in so many languages. And it really is a worldwide spiritual faith. As for the, I guess, education part of it, or like awareness part of it, I don't know of any at the moment. I know there's a lot of just like groups that oppose the CCP in general, like dissent groups that are trying to raise more awareness about like the culture of China before the Chinese Communist Party, and trying to really instate that, you know, China is not the CCP, and that its people really have, you know, their own values that they hold dear, that are not atheist, that are not communist, in that sort of way, and just trying to separate the two labels, unlike, right, trying to undo what the CCP has tried to do, which is the CCP is China, the Communist Party will be forever. Yeah.
Right. So here's a question for Cynthia and Emily, but also Grady, and I have a few questions for Grady as well. On campus, has Falun Dafa wound up becoming a rallying point at all for other dissidents from China who are not Falun Gong practitioners, and more broadly, nationally or internationally? Cynthia, this is probably a question for you. Has Falun Dafa talked to other religious groups that are persecuted in China, such as any Muslim groups or Catholic organizations, for example? Has there been any collaboration bilaterally in that sense, or multilaterally?
I'll let Emily answer first, since I feel like I've been.
No, that's fine. Not that I have known of, and I don't know if that's partially because, you know, many groups might, you know, feel unsafe doing so. You know, and sort of to answer your question before about, you know, has there been any attempt to sort of educate people on, you know, that the CCP and pro-CCP groups sort of use racism as a shield to deflect from any criticism. You know, it's so hard. Like I mentioned, there's such a knee-jerk negative reaction, you know, when people say, you know, you're being racist towards Chinese people. And even in one of the sort of complaints, one of the students said, you know, I didn't watch the film, but it's exactly, you know, this racist, the Trump administration, it's exactly what the Trump administration says, you know, like, be racist towards Chinese people. And I was like, so you're admitting that you didn't watch the film, and yet you're complaining, you know, about this film and about this promotion, and specifically saying that it's political, that it's, you know, racist. And I'm Chinese, you know, the director of the film was Chinese. Like, and I even tried to separate out, you know, I specifically said, I was like, you know, I'm Chinese. I'm very proud to be Chinese. I'm not here to criticize China. I'm not here to criticize Chinese people. I'm criticizing what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. But there's such a conflation of the two. And I think the Chinese Communist Party purposely does that to deflect from any criticism. You know, they purposely hide behind this shield of, you know, Chinese Communist Party is China. So if you're basically criticizing the Chinese Communist Party, you are criticizing Chinese people. And so again, there's such a negative knee-jerk reaction to racism. And of course, it's understandable why. No one wants to associate with racists, right? But I feel like that sort of, they use that as protection to not receive criticism. And I think, you know, it's scary to stand up to such, you know, loud voices when you're a minority on campus. You know, it's hard to do that activism. You know, just holding a film screening event can get you attacked for like a month. You know, I think a lot of students understandably may not want to subject themselves to that kind of treatment, you know, and would understandably rather just, you know, sort of lay low and just do what they need to do as students, and not sort of work through all this and, you know, field all these comments and personal attacks about racism, about political, you know, agenda and stuff like that.
Right. So to follow up question, a follow-up question I have with that is, how much do you think the broader sort of campus culture has affected this, in the sense that there's a lot of political clashing and sort of ideological things occurring on campus more broadly, aside from just this issue? And a lot of research suggests that open dialogue is basically extinct on many modern American campuses. And do you think that this is a symptom of that from at least the administrative side of them not doing anything? Or do you think it's more of an issue specific ignorance or maybe co-option by organizations like Confucius Institutes that have contributed to the climate that you're facing?
I think specifically, at least within the case studies that we've conducted over this year on all of this university repression and silencing and censorship, we've actually seen that a lot of it is actually, like you said in the latter part of your question, coming from these CCP proxies, and even in Chinese language textbooks, in Chinese language classrooms, courses held at American universities, there's a lot of language that's very false and kind of demonizes Falun Gong in the exact way that the CCP continues to demonize Falun Gong on like CCTV, Chinese state media. And that's also a concern because you talk about how there's no open dialogue, right? But the students are still going to these classes, trying to learn Mandarin, trying to, either pursue business or pursue whatever career that they want. And whenever they go to these Chinese language classes, the first thing they hear about, spirituality in China is that, it makes you go mad. Falun Gong forces people to like not eat or, not sleep and all of these crazy depictions, and they think of it as true because it's their textbook. The professor is teaching it to them, right? And you would think that in a university, especially in America, that it's very honest and independent and truthful. And so I think I wanted to highlight that point. I think it really does come from all of these tactics and all of these channels that the CCP is actually already installed inside of our universities.
Right. So, no, go ahead. Go ahead,
Okay.
please.
I just have two brief thoughts on your question. So one of them was that, the thing about open dialogue. In our open letter, we addressed this issue that, I think the Falun Dafa Club did a lot to open up that dialogue. We specifically invited the CSSA to the event. We actually invited them to every single one of our human rights screening events, especially after that first instance where they, Chinese students complained that we were allowed to advertise in the newsletter. We didn't want any misunderstandings to continue to occur, So we invited them to every human rights film screening event. We specifically invited them to In the Name of Confucius. We also invited the Temple University Confucius Institute to this Confucius Institute event. Our purpose was to open up the dialogue. We're not trying to create, this closed room of just echoing voices of the same opinion. We want to open it up. Come to this event, ask critical questions. I think that was in the description, like critical questions are encouraged, come have a discussion with us. Of course, nobody took up that offer. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was that, sorry, I'm sort of losing my train of thought. If I remember it, I'll let you know.
Well, I think I would say that, again, there is generally a lack of awareness in terms of the wider problem of transnational oppression. I do think universities know that some of these incidents are happening on their campuses, but they may not necessarily know the wider context at play. And when they do actually consider that this is a problem, there may be other factors that contribute to the reluctance to, I guess, defend some of these students more vehemently. I mean, there are financial interests and international partnerships at play that may also factor into the decision-making process when it comes to responding to these incidents. So I don't necessarily think I think it's somewhat issue-specific in that regard.
Right. So, Grady, I have a question for you, and this relates to not only this issue, but transnational oppression more broadly. There's been, all the research suggests that the entire world is becoming more authoritarian and has over the last few years. there's really very few bright spots to speak of. And I have a couple of questions related to that. Some of the increased authoritarianism has happened in light of and in context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're talking about authoritarianism within countries. Have you seen a correlating increase of transnational repression as this authoritarianism has increased within countries, or is there like no correlation at all? And my second question doesn't just relate to China, but sort of there's been these incredible events that have happened over the past 4 years. You had the forcible reabsorption of Hong Kong. You had the withdrawal of the U.S. from Afghanistan. You've had the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which these are all sort of massive authoritarian turns. Have you seen spikes in transnational repression that have correlated or corresponded with these events?
So going to your first question, was it about, have we seen an increase in transnational repression within countries? I was a little confused by the phrasing.
No, have you seen an increase of transnational repression that has increased alongside increasing authoritarianism within countries?
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, that's a good question. I do think that especially around election times and following protest events, there may be a correlation there. I mean, in general, when we look at our database, I think that more and more countries are practicing or perpetrating transnational oppression. I mean, some countries like China, Russia, Turkmenistan, their freedoms and democracy ratings, as we have at Freedom House, as they continue to drop, we don't see a concurrent drop in transnational oppression cases. We see continued cases, and I don't necessarily think that, I mean, there may be a relation there, but I don't necessarily think that more authoritarianism will signal. The way I would put it is that as crackdowns continue within countries, this may force protesters and dissidents to leave the country, and that repression may simply follow them. I think that's the easiest way of thinking about it. But as you said, in China, there have been several events like the national security law. I highlighted that in my presentation. That has been used as a tool increasingly. I don't know how familiar you are with the bounty cases that were discussed in the summer, where the pro-Beijing authorities in Hong Kong issued bounties against 8 leading figures in UK, Australia, and the UK and the United States. I think that these sort of events, going to your second question, I guess, they do create vulnerabilities for certain diaspora communities. For example, the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine made a lot of communities particularly vulnerable. There, for example, Ukraine hosted a lot of exiles and diaspora communities. And when war hits, that causes a secondary wave of immigration as people try to flee the consequences of the war. And often we've seen that traveling leaves people in a particularly tough spot as they're forced to present documents where their names may come up in databases such as Interpol or something like that. So that increases the likelihood of them being stopped and going through a long and arduous legal processes. So I do think with the invasion of Ukraine, we've seen, Russia's also targeted activists and exiles that have been against the war and have had to flee to neighboring Central Asian countries and Caucasus countries. So yeah, I don't necessarily think COVID has contributed at all to an increase in transnational oppression. But again, I would like to emphasize that more and more countries are practicing and finding themselves being recorded in our database as they learn from other countries and use these international linkages and the expansion of authoritarian networks to crack down on activism in their countries and abroad.
Yeah, you also mentioned, I have a couple more questions for Grady, and I'll open it back up. You mentioned that these different governments are collaborating increasingly with each other. Can you kind of describe how that happens? I mean, is this an issue of reach? Is this an issue of convenience? Or is it part of increased geopolitical cooperation that's more formal, like where you see Russia and China getting together? Is it more institutionalized like that, or is this thing just kind of always been happening and just kind of increases?
I mean, you do have long established security ties, for example, in a region that I focus on in Eurasia, between Russia and other Central Asian governments, which used to be a part of the Soviet Union. And following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of these security ties were still there, and some of the officials were still there. So they had that joint experience and history together to crack down on activism within the CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization, within that territory. Also in the Middle East, we're seeing increasing cooperation among members of the Arab League. There's this body called the Arab Interior Ministers Council, in which these different countries in the region funnel. They're not red notices like Interpol, but they basically have like wanted. They issue wanted notices for individuals who are in other countries in the region. And over the last year, we've seen several cases of people traveling to, let's say, Jordan or another country, being stopped at airports and being sent back to their origin country. When it comes to China, I think it can exercise its influence, geopolitical influence, and one belt, one road interest in different host countries to gain leverage when it comes to these sorts of exchanges and security interests. I think most of the more physical cases, when it like kidnappings, deportations, detentions, occur in neighboring authoritarian states, Southeast Asian countries especially are a focal point of this pursuit. I think Laos, Cambodia, these countries are often willing to collaborate with Chinese security officials to hunt down journalists or other dissident figures that China wants returned or silenced. So I think it's a mixture of like long established and well-built security ties, but also, I mean, there are institutional structures on a regional level besides Interpol that allow this problem to persist and makes it easier for some authoritarian states to collaborate.
Right. In terms of stopping this, have there been any markers of success? Are there any countries that really stand out as protecting dissidents really well from this?
That's a good question. I mean, I think different countries have adopted different techniques to respond to the issue. One interesting approach that I think deserves more attention from other countries is in Sweden and some of the other Scandinavian countries, where they've enacted refugee espionage legislation, which makes it illegal for a member of a diaspora community to spy on and report on other members of the diaspora community to the embassy of their homeland or anyone else affiliated with their homeland government. It's been applied when it comes to Uyghur communities in Sweden. I think that this oftentimes we see like this sort of espionage lead up to more physical forms of transnational oppression, or it can be a factor that allows the origin country to gain intelligence about figures that it wants to harass. So I do think it's important that countries address this. I mean, in the U.S., I think it's important that the government continue to keep monitoring cases and reporting on them. For example, in the State Department's annual human rights reports over the last several years, we've seen more of a focus on specifically transnational oppression sections in a section in that report dedicated to reporting on cases. We've also seen the FBI create a hotline for victims. And also there's legislation that's being brought about in Congress to address the issue. I think it's most important to continue raising awareness and to find ways to proactively protect members of those communities, as we've discussed on campuses. I think this proactive approach is always better than a reactive one, if possible.
Right.
I just wanted to briefly talk about for how to apply that to universities. I really encourage and recommend state level, attorney generals and different investigators to actually apply the Department of Education Section 117, which is to report foreign funding. There's a lot of private and public universities that haven't reported their public funding when it regards to China. And I think that's something that should be enacted as soon as possible and as strictly as possible, just within the university sphere, because there's really nothing to hide if you're honest about it.
Yeah, well, that's there's always something to hide. I wrote a book on money laundering. The people find ways of hiding stuff. So to kind of switch to the Q&A, there are a few questions. Some of the stuff we talked about, but this question goes to Cynthia and Emily. Has there been any major allies of yours on campus that have sort of offered moral and intellectual support, such as the National Association of Scholars? I'd like to hope that my presence here as moderator kind of answers that one. But on campus, has there been any other support for you from organizations that you might not expect, perhaps?
When I was hosting some events in Texas, so in Texas, there's like a really large population of Asian students and Chinese students in particular, like second generation Chinese students. And so actually there's another organization just called the Chinese Students Association, not affiliated, not a Chinese proxy. And it's just second generation Chinese students who, gather around and talk about culture. And so that organization, as well as the Taiwanese Hong Kong organizations, were the main ones that I turned to when it came to like promoting events or, doing collaborations or having these even like festivals like Lunar New Year festivals or Mid-Autumn Festival. A lot of these were done in collaboration. And I think there was a lot of shared values between especially like the second generation, because a lot of them, born and raised in America, and they are very aware and clear about the, CCP threat. So I found a lot of support in those organizations.
Right. What about students or any organization that's not necessarily connected or embedded within the diaspora community? Have you found support from other campus organizations that maybe face similar issues or just generally supportive and natural allies?
For me at Penn, in short, no. But I would like to think that, at other universities, there is some sort of support. Actually, when this all happened, Athena Institute was a really great resource. So I did turn to them to speak with them. But at Penn, for this specific event, we did feel sort of marginalized and like I said, we felt a little isolated, that we didn't have anyone to turn to. We were turning to administration, and administration wasn't really giving any support either. But I would like to see, more of that collaboration. I think there are at other universities, diaspora groups that are supportive. We don't have a Students for a Free Tibet at Penn, or I think there may be some Hong Kong groups or Taiwan groups, but I don't believe, at Penn specifically for this instance, they, responded or publicly showed any support for this instance.
Why do you think that is? Is it fear or do you think that it's just sort of closed off because onlookers who may be critical of China kind of just see it as maybe this is just a specific issue, it has nothing to do with me?
I think maybe a little bit of both. I know that we did extend invitations to all of our human rights film screening events, but I think there is a little bit of reluctance, to get involved because they know the potential backlash that can happen. It happens with pro-democracy events. They know that human rights film screening events, like specifically on China, might elicit this sort of pushback. So I think it's a little bit of both that you mentioned, yeah.
Okay, so I have another question here. This it'll manifest differently on how you answer it, but I want all three of you to address it. Has there been any support or pressure being brought to bear on the business community, maybe either related to investing in China. This is a Q&A that came in regarding transnational repression from your organization, or has there been more broadly, how has the business community been involved with transnational repression internationally? That's probably for Grady, but this is kind of maybe at the local level. If you're talking about campuses, you could think about, alumni or donors or anything like that.
Well, when it comes to universities, like donors and stuff exerting pressure, I haven't really come across many instances of specific threats of withholding funds or anything to a university because of this issue. It may have occurred, but I haven't seen that yet. I don't know if that's because of the lack of awareness or a lack of just will at this point, but I haven't seen that. I think when it comes to the wider issue, it's a matter of oftentimes we see the issue obliquely addressed. For example, there's been legislation when it comes to forced labor and that involves Uyghurs in China. And I think that although this isn't necessarily directly related to transnational oppression, a lot of Uyghurs who have fled China are fleeing this system as a whole. So I think that in a way, this sort of legislation that addresses the domestic concerns regarding this forced labor, and this may apply to other countries also, but I'm mainly thinking of China right now. It does acknowledge the fact that a whole community is being targeted by with unfair business practices, or I don't even want to call it that. But yeah, I think that I don't necessarily think it can. A thing that is discouraging is that oftentimes countries will come out against their adversaries and not address similar issues, similar instances of transnational oppression perpetrated by allies, such as, let's say, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia or U.S. and Egypt. They're less willing to address that, whether it be in terms of economic relations or business relations. So I think in general, it would be good to see more of a wider response to the issue when it comes to cases perpetrated by a variety of countries instead of just China and Iran and Russia, let's say.
Yeah. On the topic of, if you think of the university as a business and how a lot of the universities actually have branches inside China, like NYU Shanghai, the University of California system, what we've seen just from, the student side is that a lot of the students are concerned and have experienced being photographed or, different forms of surveillance. So like just overall from our survey, we found 7 out of 30 students were, reported one incident of suspected physical or digital surveillance. And while this is going on simultaneously, there was actually on August 14th, a dean from the University of California school system visited Shanghai. And, she connected with students, alumni, industry partners. This is from her post. And she's incredibly excited to be back there. Delighted to reopen the USC community in Shanghai and in China. And she had basically 3 other paragraphs about fostering collaboration with China and the, wonderful future that they'll have there. And I feel like having these 2 cases side by side is really telling, and kind of you can see how while the students who are marginalized are experiencing one reality, the deans of the school are really chasing after another goal, and it's not to protect the students. And I feel like there's a really miscommunication or not enough of a roundtable discussion or overall awareness about this situation, because there are students, international students in the UC system who've told us that their family was called regarding their whereabouts, that they get photographed whenever they hold Falun Gong events, and it's really a lot of pressure for them because they're going to go back to China, potentially face detention or what have you, and the deans of the school are traveling on these, luxury business trips, really having like such a close connection with the Chinese Communist Party. And I feel like that's something that should be stopped. These collaboration and these business ties, because it's really kind of, completely blind to what the students are actually facing and what they're worried about.
Right. Here's a question. So Harvard recently shifted their Chinese language partnership from mainland China to Taiwan. Has there been any effort or assistance or collaboration with organizations in Taiwan that have been beneficial on campus? Or maybe to Grady, with transnational repression from China, has Taiwan been of any assistance to those fleeing transnational repression from China?
Well, I think actually we've seen some cases in the past involving, it's a tricky subject because of the way China considers Taiwan to be part of its territory. So we've seen cases in that regard. I do think neighboring states are aware of the issue. That doesn't mean that they've necessarily done anything to address it. In fact, not so much Taiwan, but I would like to reiterate that countries that have strong economic interests and ties with China don't want to jeopardize those for the sake of protecting certain diaspora groups. So it's a tightrope that some of these countries are walking. But yeah, I think a lot of democracies have brought this issue up at things like the Summit of Democracy and other high-profile events. It's just that some countries have, I guess, they would think more to lose when it comes to dealing with this issue.
I guess I can add like a little bit to that. It has a little bit to do with the question that you asked, Ian, about the money, and then also the point that I forgot earlier. But I think, the Chinese international student population at Penn and a lot of these universities is so broad. It's huge. And I think, like Grady mentioned, like Cynthia mentioned, and also that's mentioned in the Name of Confucius, the documentary, it's this issue of self-censorship. Does it really matter that we're, having this Confucius Institute if we just don't talk about the bad stuff? We just talk about the good stuff. We're not censoring, we're just not acknowledging that these bad things exist. Does it really matter that there are, marginalized groups on campus if we just don't talk about them? It's like Grady said, it's like you don't want to risk this huge financial investment of students, of money that these universities get from China, from, foreign governments. Does it really matter that this small minority on campus may be suffering, may feel marginalized, if this benefit, it sort of outweighs that risk of like making this group feel marginalized and vulnerable on campus, right? Does it really matter?
Right. Because we're running short on time here. I want to kind of open it up to a bigger question. There's been some data that indicates that there's growing discontent in China itself, particularly among younger Chinese. And you brought up the issue of self-censorship. And one of the reasons that authoritarian regimes, they tend to spy, and this is coming from political science literature, is because of the authoritarian nature. What happens is there's no feedback mechanism for populations to express their discontent with policy or aspects of life. There's no elections, there's no freedom of press, etc. So as a result, the government doesn't really know what anyone's thinking. So that increases the incentive to spy and crack down further. And then there's this feedback effect that kind of cycles until you get increasingly totalitarian. But nonetheless, there's this growing sort of discontent. And I'm wondering if this incentive to self-censor or falsify preferences among within China itself, do you think that that's changing at all based on what you're hearing in the diaspora community or the data that you're seeing at Freedom House, Grady? I'd like to open that up to the big sort of bookend question.
Just as I guess, within my microcosm, within my community, because I'm from Houston, Texas, so there's a rather large Chinese diaspora community there. Because of, I guess, several events, including anti-espionage laws and things like that, there are more Chinese, especially like the elderly relatives who are able or like wanting to come to America and stay here. And then within China, a lot of our relatives have, developed a sense for circumvention tools and for all of these VPNs. I know some organizations work with like Siphon or others that actually help citizens, receive free internet, receive all of this information. And I feel like that has become an opening for a lot of the information and a lot of more freer dialogue to occur. And I feel like that's actually lessened that fear of, being caught or that self-censorship. And there's actually a joke that, there's like 50 security cameras on every single, pole in China, but since it's made in China, most of them probably don't work. So that's the general consensus, just what I've seen.
I think something that I would like to point out that we have found, I want to specifically look at universities right now, is that it's related to this question of espionage. I'm not talking about espionage in terms of diaspora members reporting on diaspora members, but rather espionage for the purpose of gaining intelligence or this foreign intelligence gathering. I think that one problem that we've noticed is that often on university websites or whatnot, the practice of transnational oppression is conflated with these foreign intelligence gathering efforts. Indeed, I would say that in most of the cases, these universities almost focus exclusively on protecting intellectual property from foreign governments like China and safeguarding research integrity. I actually think that we think that this security-driven approach operates to the detriment of a more rights-based emphasis on academic freedom and free speech on behalf of these students. I think that this sort of security-based response can actually wind up marginalizing these foreign scholar communities and students instead of protecting their rights. I mean, we should always focus on protecting the rights of scholars and students from countries like China or any other country that we may focus on for these intelligence gathering operations. This is the best way to secure campus against foreign interference in general, I think, and to maximize the free speech rights of these students.
All right. So as we are quickly running out of time, is there anything any of you would like to sort of leave the viewers with as sort of closing thoughts?
If I may add one more recommendation, I think Emily did a good job of discussing solidarity and what Cynthia pointed out about like the use of certain textbooks and stuff. It's interesting and troublesome. As I said, raising awareness of the issue is the first step in terms of responding adequately to the issue. And I think something that universities could do at the most basic level, I guess, I mean, it would require resources and time, but it shouldn't be too much of a drag for these administrators to realize, would be to add some sort of tutorial or session at orientation, campus orientation on transnational oppression and what it is, talking about trends, cases, maybe invite experts, civil society experts to discuss the matter. Oftentimes, students who are coming from other countries are adjusting to a new community and may not even be aware of this practice, or they may know what it is, but may not be able to put a name to it, or may be frazzled when it comes to actually reporting cases. So ideally, universities would talk to students about this to send a message that this is not okay, but to also make it be known that they are ready to address the issue, hopefully. And I think Cynthia has brought this up in her research, but kind of establishing some sort of reporting mechanism once this orientation is in place, so that students can use this knowledge to protect themselves if they see it necessary, and to make the campus community a better place in general.
And then the next step after the reporting mechanism would be the university has to figure out a contingency plan, because this has happened for way too long for them to be just unaware and, oh, what's that? Like, oh, someone's being monitored. Oh, I don't know what to do. You know, like Emily was faced with a month-long, reprisal campaign that was targeted towards her and her club members. Like, oh, we don't know what to do. We'll just talk about it and then not include her in the conversation. It's long past those excuses. And I really think they should have a contingency plan, stick to the code of conduct, have best practices, and really, really stick to that every single time that something like this happens. And
I think for me, one thing I'll mention is that sort of one of the complaints that I found really interesting, that we received from the student, like in one of the complaints, what this student said was, we recognize the free speech of Falun Dafa on campus, and we don't mind if they do it in their own space. But we don't want this to be promoted. We don't want it, we don't want this speech outside of their own space. We don't care if they talk about this within their own space, but don't have it on a university level. So I think in that sense, the university can do better in helping us feel supported, in that we don't have to, why should we have to confine this discussion to our own groups? What is the purpose of raising awareness within our own groups when we all know what's happening? The purpose is to raise awareness across the university and have university admins sort of take a proactive approach in helping support our voice, right? Why should we be confined to our own little room, to our own little space, so that nobody else can hear what we're saying? It's supporting free speech, but it's not really free speech because you're keeping us within our own little bubble. So like I mentioned, I think there was a lot that UPenn could have done to help us feel supported. Even so much as just saying, there will be differences in opinion, but, go about it in a civil way. We support students as long as they're following the university policies, as long as they're following the code of conduct. There should be this no discouragement of students freely expressing. I think something as simple as that, or even just an email in support, right? I feel like we didn't even get so much as that. But I think overall, there's just not that support there. It's sort of a brush it under the rug. This will blow over eventually. These students will be gone in 4 years. So it's not really a big deal. So that's kind of just my sense. And I think universities can take that step to just be a little bit more proactive in helping us feel supported.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to our close. I appreciate everyone for tuning in, and special thanks to Cynthia, Emily, and Grady for the work that they do. And this has been Beijing's Influence on American University Campuses, the Falun Gong Case Study and Beyond, Beijing's Influence on American University Campuses. I'm from the NAS. Everyone here is doing amazing work on bringing awareness to this issue and what the CCP is doing on college campuses. And I'm sure they'd be happy to answer any questions you may have after the event if they reach out to you. So please do keep in touch, and thanks for attending.